Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about a node that side effects created to potentially make your life a little bit easier when working with RBDs. Because what we've done so far is we created a lot of nodes to do all the steps that we needed before geometry can go into an RBD simulation. So we packed the geometry in with the assemble node, then we set velocity with a separate velocity node, and then depending on what you prefer, you can either set density or you can set mass directly. So as you can see, even for the standard stuff that you do a lot, you need a lot of nodes. So side effects thought, well, maybe we can streamline this and do all those things that you do anyway in a single node. And that is the RBD configure. And like I said, this node does multiple things at once. So first of all, it actually packs your geometry, as you can see. It actually turns it into a single point already. And already, as you can see, sets a couple of attributes like bounce, density, and a name attribute, just like the assemble does. Now, before I move on, I want to say this early on. I do not like this node. I don't use it, and I will not use it throughout the course for multiple reasons. First of all, I think it's easier to understand when every node is doing one thing and not one node is doing 10 things. I find this easier later on to read what your network is doing. And also what I don't like about the RBD configure is, as you can see, it creates a lot of attributes by default that I maybe do not want to set. So if you're like me, you might not want to use this node. For everyone else, it's a nice way of doing multiple things in one node that you would do anyway. So first of all, as we've seen, this node already packs the geometry that comes in and also gives it a name attribute. And of course, by the way, this will work with multiple objects as well. It handles multiple objects just like the assemble does with an internal connectivity. But it only does that if it is not already packed and has a name attribute. So if I create an assemble here, first just to set a name attribute without packing the sphere, so it's not packed, but I gave it a name attribute, maybe, I don't know, ball 0 or something, then you can see that the RBD configure will not overwrite this name. So if it already recognizes a name attribute, it will not create a new one. It will still pack it, but that's the next thing. If the assemble is already packing it and a packed geometry comes in, then of course it will not pack it again. So the node will understand what is already done and will not do this again in terms of packing and naming. Now, besides that, you can set all kinds of attributes that, can be interpreted by the RBD bullet solver. And for some reason, you can't set velocity. I don't understand why. The velocity is transferred from before. So if you want to set the velocity, you would still have to create your own node. I don't understand that, but fair enough. But you can create other attributes that we will talk about later, like active, animated, and deforming, and also stuff like sleeping, enable sleeping per object even. And then here you can even set certain geometry representations per object if you want. So if for some reason, even though you shouldn't do that, you want to interpret a particular object as concave, then you can actually do this. Also interesting is you can set the collision padding specifically for each object. And of course, all of this is just creating a couple of attributes. So this can be a good way of learning what attributes you can set. But I will not talk about this here in the fundamentals course because this is a bit outside of the realm of the absolute basics. There's other things like collision groups and speed limits. Feel free to do a little bit of R&D on that. But what I wanted to talk about is the physical attributes, which basically just means density, because you cannot actually set mass directly. It's always working with densities. And the idea here is, and this is kind of interesting, that you can choose from a couple of presets. So for example, you can choose here metal and then a certain type of metal, gold or aluminium, and then it will create a particular density for that. And of course, you can always override this as well. And here you can see it sets the density. Again, never the mass, it only works with density. Personally, I don't find this as useful because as far as I know, the density only has, or mass, is only interpreted whenever objects interact with each other. There is no other context where the mass plays a role. And in those cases, it's all about the relationship between the numbers. So those physical numbers here are absolutely not necessary. And there's no reason why you have to, slavishly follow the real numbers. So I find this a bit confusing because, it suggests something that is useful when it's not, but nonetheless, here you can choose that if you want. I never use that. And then as you can see, you can also set bounds and frictions, so physical properties that we know from POPs, if you want on a per object basis as well. So again, the reason I don't like this node is it basically does too many things at the same time. So I don't want this node to pack my geometry and give it a name attribute and set the density and maybe other things that were, the bounds by default. So just clicking it in will do 4 different things on my geometry. This might be fine if I know exactly what I want, and of course I can change this. But again, I find this confusing, and especially for beginners, this will influence the behavior of your geometry because the bounds property and the density property are now set without you maybe realizing. So yeah, that's the RBD configure node. It's not a bad idea, it covers multiple things in one node that you would do usually anyway. I will not use it throughout the course. I prefer, as a very least for learning, to do every single step manually so that you have more control, you know exactly what you're doing, and especially later on you can actually read better what you did in your branch, in your network, even though then it's a bit longer of course, but it makes it much easier later on to understand what you actually did. And it doesn't do anything that you don't want. So if you don't care about those limitations, feel free to use it. You can actually do most of the things we do throughout the course with the RBD configure as well. But nonetheless, I hope this is helpful to know about this node. So thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.